You know, I kind of feel like I'm one of the only people on the planet that don't want to get other people sick when they get sick. Because, you know, I never realized how, like, commonplace dry coughing was. It's like you're just going around minding your own business all day, and then all of a sudden someone walks by and is like, ugh! And it's like, it's fucking disgusting. I don't get it. You are the reason why pandemics start. But, yeah. I'm over here, recording this on my phone in a closet. This is, yeah, I've never claimed to be a professional. I'm just some dipshit that likes talking about video games. So with that being said, let's get into the ideal Resident Evil game. Now, when we're talking about a video game, or better yet, how to make a video game, or discussing video games at their core, we first have to talk about gameplay loops. So, for example, in the Resident Evil series, I can identify two different kinds of gameplay loops. The first pertains to the more survival horror-oriented games. Let's take Resident Evil 2002. Now, in this game here, the gameplay loop tends to go like this. I explore an area, I identify the threats in the area, or objectives or obstacles, I just figure out what's going on. I face those threats, I solve those puzzles, I do whatever I have to do, and expend the necessary resources in order to get by, and then I save the game and make sure I don't lose the progress. Make sure that the sacrifices that I made in those situations were not for nothing. Then I repeat it with exploring, identifying, using resources, and saving again. That is the gameplay loop of those older Resident Evil games. Then you have the more action-oriented gameplay loop. Let's take Resident Evil 4 for example. Now, Resident Evil 4 is all about surveying the territory around me, creating the spacing I need between me and the enemies, shooting the enemies with the appropriate weaponry, then repositioning. And then of course that starts up all again. Once I'm done repositioning, I'm scanning the environment, creating that space, using weapons, then I'm repositioning. So the question at that point there becomes, which is better? Is it better to have the more survival horror oriented gameplay loop, or is it better to have the more action oriented gameplay loop? And the answer is actually really simple. They're both really fucking good. Resident Evil is great. It doesn't matter if it's being horror, it doesn't even matter if it's being action. Resident Evil 5, Resident Evil 6, and all those crazy action bangs are fucking stellar games. Just as good as the originals, they're just a different genre of game. However, we need to look at this subjectively, or I'm going to be looking at this subjectively. You gotta keep that in mind. I am making my ideal Resident Evil game. And with that being said, I'm gonna focus this gameplay loop on the classic survival horror games. I find there's a lot more tension, it's a lot more enjoyable for a single player experience, it's just much more engaging for me and provides a lot more depth. So to reiterate what that loop is, it's the basic idea of exploring an area, identifying your threats and objectives, using resources to accomplish your objectives and get by those threats, saving your game, and then going to explore the next area.
I fucking love Tame Impala. Hey, Super Cop, how many people you think are in Tame Impala?
I don't know, maybe 4?
It's just one guy, isn't that crazy? Wait, hold on, let me pull them up.
Now that we've got the gameplay loop down, now that we know we're going to make this a much more classic feeling Resident Evil game, let's start talking about a little bit of a premise. Now, I believe the most enjoyable character to play as within Resident Evil, because they balance, the feeling of being a badass but still being vulnerable enough, both in personality and in capability, that you do feel like you're on the back foot and really need to use your resources and wits to survive, is of course Jill Valentine. There is like no game in the series or no moment with this character, no portrayal that I don't enjoy. Whether it's, the soft-hearted Jill in Resident Evil 5, or if it is the, attitude-ridden, hiding that kind of post-traumatic stress from the Spencer Mansion Jill from Resident Evil 3 Remake. I like Jill in whatever forms. Whatever face, whatever voice, whatever attitude, Jill is the way I go. So of course, in my ideal Resident Evil game, we are going to be playing as Jill Valentine. Now, in regards of a short little story premise, I'm picturing Jill gets a letter, or Jill gets a message from someone she knows and is close to. Maybe this is Moira, maybe this is Carlos, maybe this is Barry. I would say Chris, but we've already done the whole Chris in distress thing in Resident Evil Revelations. So I'd want it to be one of the characters, probably more so Carlos or Moira, who haven't gotten as much attention. Jill will get a message from one of these characters saying that something is going really wrong. There's some kind of BOW event happening in this remote tundra-based town. I'm thinking something like Alaskan, North American, Pacific Northwest tundra type of feel to this town. So hearing that a friend is in distress, Jill of course makes her way there. However, once she gets there, she slowly starts to realize that the town is more so of a front for an abandoned Umbrella facility in which they were creating mimics, monsters that could take the shape or form of any human or animal being they came into contact with, and the town is now overridden. So Jill needs to fight her way through the mimics, try to save as many people who aren't mimics, and figure out where that message came from and what the truth behind all of this really is. Now, if you know me, you know within these videos the story isn't really too important when I'm pitching these ideas, but creating that premise to explain why Jill is here, why is she fighting mimics, what's going on, is important as I break the rest of this game down.
Jesus fucking Christ, do you ever blink?
Let's talk about this game and how it would play step by step, level by level. The first level would be quite simple. I don't even know if I would describe it as a level. I would have it be the slow walk through the town, where you get acquainted with the controls, looking around, walking. I'd probably go with a little bit more of that third-person camera, just because Resident Evil has proved that you can do a third-person shooter with the whole classic feeling Resident Evil vibes. Maybe I'd have some parts have fixed cameras if I wanted to get artsy-fartsy or communicate something in a specific way that would affect the gameplay and narrative alike, but for the most part, what I'm picturing, at least as of right now, is that third-person camera. So yeah, just have a little bit of a little walk through the woods where Jill gets used to this stuff. You figure out how to aim your gun, you can mess around with different things, crouch, that sort of thing. Then you're going to end up in the town. When you're in the town, you're going to have your first combat encounter with one of the mimics. Although at this point here, you're not really going to know it's a mimic because it's just going to be a crazy monster that's all disfigured coming at you. Here's your little combat tutorial. We'll talk more about the specifics of the sandbox, but for now, this will end with Jill ending up in this large type of mansion space, in which she'll come into contact with survivors. Now, these survivors are the last survivors of this town, and they've trapped themselves in this mansion with the hope of figuring out a backwards exit to get through this mansion and disappear into the forest mountain behind the town. However, to get through it, Jill and the survivors will have to solve puzzles, figure out who's a mimic and who's still human, and come out on top. Now, this part is going to be very Resident Evil 1 Remake. You're going to have your set rooms, you're going to have your set puzzles, you're going to have to try to find items to unlock certain rooms or solve certain puzzles. There'll be different documents to give you more hints to what's going on, and That sort of thing. It's something that we've seen time and time again in Resident Evil. What's going to make it different here is that rather than having zombies stalk certain halls, you're going to have a set group of survivors, and while you are solving these puzzles, you're going to have to try to figure out which ones are mimics. Because if you ignore everybody and just go about your business trying to speedrun this mansion, you're going to get ambushed by mimics, and these mimics are going to be very hard to kill. Now, I said before that the sandbox would be discussed later, but it's relevant to right now, so let's talk about how these mimics are going to work. The mimics will come in 3 stages. The first stage is the incognito mimic. This is where they are pretending to be a person or an animal. I imagine there's going to be 3 things that these mimics can turn into: a human, a dog, or a deer. Now, when they're in this state, they are not going to be hostile. They're going to be acting like whatever it is they're pretending to be. However, when your back is to them, you may hear certain suspicious sounds. If you catch them at the right point, you'll see them mid-transformation before they attack. If you catch them at mid-transformation, you can fight them before they evolve to the next point of mimic. If you fail to catch them, or if you fail to figure out whether or not they're a mimic, and they turn into a phase 2 mimic, which is we'll call them combat mimics, you're going to have a very hard time. These things are going to take a lot of bullets, you're going to need to get those critical hits, you're going to need to be incredibly accurate, or you're going to need to be using a strong weapon. Now, if you fail to catch a mimic, even after it's transformed in this combat form and you don't put it down in that moment there, it will eventually turn into a alpha mimic. Now, the alpha mimic is going to be the true form of the monster. It's going to be crawling on 4 legs, jumping around like a spider, and it's going to be like a licker on steroids. So the idea is to kill the mimics when they're in phase 1. You get the jump on them, because if you can kill them while they're still mimicking something, they won't take that much to kill. If they get to phase 2 in that mid-transformation state, it's going to take a lot to kill them, but it's going to be a slow-moving type of zombie creature. If they get to phase 3, and that's when you're really going to have a problem. So as Jill's going to be going through the mansion, she'll have to watch the survivors she's coming into contact with as she explores. Are they twitching a weird way? Are they saying weird things? Is their behavior a little twitchy and weird? If Jill happens to kill a survivor that isn't a mimic, this will result in all of these survivors becoming hostile towards Jill. Now, hostile survivors will try to hide and ambush Jill while she's going throughout the mansion and doing things, so it adds another layer of threat. In terms of how the survivors would act during combat, I'd make them a one-shot kill if they get close to you, so you'll have to be really observant to see where they're hiding. But if you catch them at further away, they'll either try to run away or, you'll just shoot them and put them down. So it's going to be a very kind of paranoia-driven type of horror in this mansion section. Once you manage to get through it, you'll get to the woods behind the town. And at this point here, Jill will have obtained information that the person that contacted her is towards the top of the mountain. Now, as you enter the forest, you're going to meet a friend. A white German shepherd is going to come up to you and save Jill at some point from a mimic. At this point here, the dog and Jill will make their way through the forest up the mountain. Now, as you're going through the forest, you'll come across many different forest animals, and you'll have to try to figure out your way through the pathways here. This is going to be more about like navigation-based puzzles where it's like a big maze, and you need to look for like small like notifiers as to where you are to get through this. And while you're going through the maze, the dog is going to be helping you and identify whether or not what's walking by is just an animal, or if it's a mimic waiting to ambush you. I see it as a fun change of pace and a nice way to build a relationship with something you can trust after going through an experience where you don't really trust anything or anyone. After making your way through the forest maze, you and your furry companion are going to reach the top, at which the dog no longer wants to come with you. Jill, having a good reason for venturing forward to figure out what kind of facility is here and whether or not she really has a friend in danger, still pushes on. At this point here, you'll enter a cave, and you'll see a very ominous looking elevator, the kind of shit that you really don't want to go on. You're going to hop onto it and you're going to start moving down. And as it goes down, you're going to have this eerie sound play, and you're going to see blood on the walls. You're going to see scratches. You're going to just have a droning ambience that just makes you more and more uncomfortable. And then once you reach the bottom, silence. This is going to be the mines, and probably the most horror-focused part of the game. Now, the mines are going to be pitch black. You either need to utilize flashlights or night vision goggles, which you can find at an earlier point in the game. Again, we're going to talk about the sandbox later. In the mines, it's going to be filled to the brim with Stage 3 alpha mimics. This is where crouching and sneaking are going to become super important. Now, unlike lickers, alpha mimics are not blind. So if you don't have night vision goggles and you're using a flashlight or a torch, you need to be aware of the fact that you might be attracting enemies to you. So you kind of have to balance out stumbling around in the dark or figuring out where you're going at the risk of bringing enemies towards you. And again, alpha mimics are incredibly difficult enemies. So the horror here is going to come from trying to stay undetected while these really tough enemies are trying to find you. To make this area even worse, I'm thinking we could have a stage 4 type of mimic, which is a tyrant type enemy that will stalk Jill through this area. This area is going to be filled with you running away the majority of the time, and it's going to be brutal to get through. However, if you found useful items earlier on, if you stockpiled your ammo, or if you're really good with the stealth mechanics in the game, which again we will talk about later, you'll make it through here. After the mines, we get to the final part of the game, which is the old castle. Now, this castle is going to be like more of that like Victorian aesthetic rather than straight up medieval, like something out of Resident Evil 4. And it's going to be the front for an old Umbrella laboratory where these mimics were being assembled. Now, this final area is going to be like a gauntlet of everything you faced up until this point. Every type of mimic is going to be here. Are you talking to a scientist, or is this someone who's going to try to take your head off? Are you going to spend your ammo on the combat mimics, or do you want to save it for when you come up against alpha mimics? You'll have traversal puzzles, you'll have darkness areas, and you'll have those more stereotypical Resident Evil puzzles. Until you eventually make your way through the castle, you get to the final room, where you find out that this entire thing was a ploy. Some crazy Umbrella scientist had taken either Moira or Carlos hostage and used them to bait you here, because this scientist wants whatever kind of T-virus genetics are going through Jill's veins. Doesn't matter if she's dead or alive. The scientist wants to combine the T-virus with the mimic virus and try to create some crazy eugenics-based monster. Now, of course, once you reach him, he'll turn himself into some giant kind of abomination, probably along the same lines of the Tyrant. You'll have to try to survive him until either Moira or Carlos throw you the rocket launcher that you use to take him down. You fly away in a helicopter while the facility explodes, bada beam bada boom, and there's your Resident Evil game.
Carlos, you're really starting to grind my gears.
But now this is where we really get into the meat of things. We're going to start talking about the sandbox now. Now, before we start talking about weapons, I want to talk about how Jill will move and handle. Now, I love how she handles in the Resident Evil 3 remake. While Resident Evil 4 Remake's parrying system is really cool, it does tend to make me feel a little too overpowered. Whereas Jill's dodge attack, which lets me, score criticals if I time it perfectly, makes me feel like I'm on the back foot and just barely making it by to deliver the blows I need to, deliver. It makes me feel just strong enough to have a fighting chance, but I'm still dodging. The basic psychology of having to get out of the way of something that is hitting me still serves that whole survival horror element there. I would like to have the escape items, like the knife, taser, and different kinds of grenades from Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 2 remakes. I like having, the knife as a normal thing, but I find having these specific subsets of weapons have much more tactical usage as these kind of like break-free type weapons. For example, stuffing a flashbang into a zombie's mouth and then shooting it so that everything else around it gets stunned is pretty tactical. I mean, imagine you're in the mines and you're being attacked by an alpha mimic, you put a flashbang in its mouth, you shoot it, everything lights up, all of a sudden all the mimics are like blind and stunned, and you can use a flashlight to figure your way through there. Or maybe you're fighting a strong tyrant type mimic and it has you in a grasp, and you throw a grenade in its face, then you shoot it, and it does a bunch of damage that stuns it for a while, giving you time to get away. Then of course the knife and the taser just make sure that a combat type mimic, or maybe even one survivor that has lost trust in you, gets right off of you. Both of these mechanics are really good for survival horror because while they give me a chance to fight back, it never feels like I am the one who has the advantage. It feels like I am just getting by. I mentioned before that I'd like to have crouching and stealth mechanics. Now, like I said, some of these mimics in their later phases are going to be really hard to fight. And while I don't want you to be able to sneak up behind everything and insta-kill stab it in the back of the neck, weaker mimics, yeah, I want you to be able to do that. The stronger mimics, I want stealth to be a way where you can just get around them. Now, I don't want you to be able to throw bricks and bottles and then sneak by that way, but if you find that there's something to crawl behind or something to, crouch behind while a mimic's moving around, you can just kind of finesse your way around him. I feel it's very tense and very rewarding slipping by an enemy that could kill you easily without them even knowing you're there. Now, the Resident Evil series has a very straightforward formula with its weapons. I, of course, am going to go with a single-purpose version of this formula. Why am I going to go with a single-purpose version of this formula when, Resident Evil has done it so good as a level up or as something in between? Well, that's easy. You see, there's this game called Halo 1, and Halo 1 showcases how having certain weapons fulfill a very specific job that no other weapon fulfills makes each weapon feel equally important to the other. There is no weapon that gets overlooked, and there is no weapon that takes the center stage. Of course, I'm not talking about multiplayer, I am talking about Halo Combat Evolved's campaign. I want this ideal Resident Evil game to have that same kind of feeling where neither one of your guns feels more or less important than the other, but they all fulfill a specific role, and you need to utilize them all together to make it through the survival horror experience. So the starter weapon is going to be the M9A3. I feel like we could call this the Samurai Edge Mark II, make it like a cool modernized version of Jill's classic pistol. The M9A3 and FDE definitely has this kind of vibe. You can get some upgrades for it that add a suppressor to it and maybe a laser sight. The laser sight because, in third-person shooting, lasers make aiming so much easier. And the suppressor because maybe if you can pop off a mimic while it's in its, mimic phase without other mimics knowing, you can decrease the chance of them transforming into a stronger form. So having that kind of added stealth benefit would be pretty cool. And if you have to get into a fight with a mimic, it might be better not to alert the other ones around it. But yeah, this is going to be like the pistols in Resident Evil 2 or Resident Evil 1 Remake, or hell, even Resident Evil 3 Remake. It's going to be a fairly weak mid-range weapon that you use mostly because you always have a decent amount of ammunition for it. However, if you want to employ this pistol in the most effective way possible, you'll be using the dodge mechanic, since this pistol is at its best when you can dodge aim and get a critical and then take the enemy down in just a couple shots. So if you're smart and you want to conserve ammo, this is the weapon you're going to be using, and you're going to be dodging a lot to take down enemies. Then we have the shotgun. Now in regards to Resident Evil shotguns, my favorite is the Resident Evil 3 Remake shotgun. I love the idea that you go from a pump action shotgun that's a very slow but hard hitting single enemy, controller, to a semi-auto, fast-firing, hard-hitting, crowd-clearing type of weapon. So I'm literally just going to port over that shotgun with the exact same upgrades. On the note of upgrades, I want to just be very specific and say that I like Resident Evil 3 Remakes or Resident Evil 2 Remakes version of upgrades. The merchant system is cool and all, but I don't want you just buying upgrades. I want you to explore the environment and find these upgrades in areas that, will reward your curiosity. They're integrated into the world much more specifically. I'll find the semi-auto upgrade for my shotgun in the world. I'll find the suppressor for my Samurai Edge Mark II in the world. Then we get to the grenade launcher. Probably one of the most interesting parts of the core weapon trinity of Resident Evil, because in these games, no matter how they're going about it, the majority of the time you have that pistol, you have that shotgun, and you have that grenade launcher. Now the grenade launcher, I'm going to make just a single, break barrel M79 type of weapon. You'll have a bunch of different grenade types. You'll have, an incendiary grenade type, which is just general damage. You'll have a specific grenade type that can reveal if something's a mimic without killing something that isn't a mimic. So if you want to avoid getting all the survivors on your ass, you can use that. You can have grenade types that will melt even the strongest mimics down with acid rounds. So, you'll have stuff for boss fights, you'll have stuff for figuring out if mimics are mimics, and you'll have just a general type of damage type of grenade. And of course, the upgrades will just, make this thing better at ranges or just have wider spread. Then lastly, we have the category of weapon that really rubs me the wrong way when it comes to Resident Evil weapon balancing: the magnums. I hate the magnums. I always found them really fucking just not redundant, but just not special enough. Because again, with that holy trinity, you had the pistol, which is just your weak, mid-range, jack-of-all-trades that you get a ton of ammo for. Your shotgun is your single zombie destroyer, and then your grenade launcher is your boss fight and specialty weapon. The magnum is just kind of okay, here's another really strong boss fight type weapon. However, I feel like Resident Evil itself remedied this problem, albeit kind of half-heartedly, in Resident Evil 4. You see, in Resident Evil 4, not only do you have pistols, not only do you have shotguns, and not only do you have explosives, but you have rifles. Now, rifles, in my mind, make much more sense than a magnum, because they're much easier to differentiate from your shotgun and grenade launcher and pistol. Let me explain. Rather than having a magnum that Jill can find to fight mimics with, I would like to put in a bolt-action rifle. This rifle has insane amounts of damage. The ammo is crazy rare. However, you can either use this to take down mimics from really far away. So if you're on low health, or if you want to clear an area and make it easy before you go into it, you can do that before the mimics can even have a chance to hurt you. Or you can save the ammunition in this and use it during boss fights to just deliver a shit ton of damage. Now, in regards to the upgrades for this bolt action, I'd probably make a thermal scope that lets you know if something's a mimic or not, that you can find towards the end of the game. You can find a suppressor so mimics don't really hear you from super far away. And then maybe just a parts kit that makes you cycle the bolt much faster. Now, you might be hearing a little difference in the audio. That's because I'm recording this at a later time, but I also wanted to mention, in regards to the Sandbox, I'd like to include kind of a full auto type of weapon. I'd probably go with a Zenocode out AK and have it act very similar to the TMP. Probably have this saved towards the end for that final gauntlet level as a little bit of a way to even out the odds between you and the mimics. And yeah, then of course, the rocket launcher that you use to take out whatever giant monstrosity the final guy turns into. And then in regards to like storing items and stuff, I would have like save rooms, I would have the item box, and you'd have niche items that weren't necessarily puzzle, recovery, or ammo, stuff like night vision goggles, maybe a lure for certain kinds of mimics, or different like area specific tools that are going to be really helpful at one point but are better kept in the box at other points in the game. Now, we talked about the basic premise, we talked about the enemies, we talked about the weapon sandbox, we've talked about the levels. Now, for a perfect single-player Resident Evil game, the next thing to talk about is replayability. Now, for this, we first have to talk about unlocks. Now, for unlocks, of course, I want to go with a lot of costumes, because unlockable costumes are one of the most fun parts of games. So of course you'll have the default Jill Valentine winter outfit that you use throughout the entire game. She'll start off with a jacket but eventually lose it like Leon does, so after you beat the game you'll get a variant where you get to keep the jacket. Beating the game on a hard difficulty will give you Jill's classic outfit from Resident Evil 1. Beating the game without killing something that isn't a mimic will give you Jill's costume from Resident Evil 3. I'm thinking that, beating the dog section without having the dog take any damage, which will be very difficult to do because you'll have to protect him as much as he's protecting you, will unlock a Fiona costume, and with the Fiona costume you get to have the dog with you throughout the entire game, making it much easier on repeat playthroughs because you'll always know what's a mimic and what isn't. And then if you beat the game and you do some kind of weird side challenge that's like optional, maybe it's finding collectibles, maybe it's killing a certain amount of enemies, maybe it's doing just a certain thing a bunch of certain times, you'll unlock a lady costume from Devil May Cry 3. I really want to include Fiona and Lady here because crossover costumes are super cool, and Capcom really doesn't do enough of this. There's no Leon costume for Dante, and there's no Dante costume for Leon, for example, which should really be a thing considering the character's origins. I want to have a mercenaries mode that you can unlock where you get a bunch of different characters that you can work towards by getting different ranks or challenges within the mercenaries mode. You start off with Jill, you can get Carlos, you can get Moira, maybe someone else is a bonus, perhaps someone from a different series like, I don't know, maybe fucking Dante. Why not? Crossovers are cool, like I just said. Have like concept art you can unlock, have different models, the soundtrack, maybe even do what Haunting Ground does and have a special room for all of your unlocks that you can see. And yeah, with that in mind, that is my idea of the perfect single-player Resident Evil game. But what do you guys think? I asked you guys what you thought like in a post not too long ago as to what the best Resident Evil game would be, and I heard a lot of differing interesting opinions, so let me know what you guys think about this. Anyways, this has been Pliskin, and yeah, I hope I feel better and I can get back to my normal kind of production process, but for now I hope you guys enjoyed this video. And this has been Pliskin, over and out.
This is Solid Snake. Hey, subscribe to Pliskin Boy. God damn it.
You heard him.